I'm Linda Warner, 71 years old, and if you'd told me last spring that my own daughter would try to put something in my wine, I'd have called you a fool. Yet there I was, standing in my own kitchen with a carving fork in my hand, watching the man she married wobble and sweat after he drank from my glass, rosemary and lemon hanging in the air. Every shadow in that room sharper than I could ever remember. Even now, I can see Megan's red dress and the way her eyes never met mine, the way the china glinted under candlelight while everyone pretended not to notice what was happening. And I remember thinking, they truly believe I am harmless before I go any further. Tell me where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground in your own home, tap that like and subscribe button for me. I was born in a small town west of St. Louis, the kind of place where you know your neighbors by the way their porch lights glow and how they shovel their walks after a storm. My mother taught me to bake bread before I learned long division. My father could fix anything that didn't run on batteries, and I grew up believing that if you worked hard, treated people right, and kept your word, you could weather just about anything. Kindness and thrift were the currency in our house. We wore hand-me-downs and polished the silver for Sunday dinner, even when it was just meatloaf and mashed potatoes on the table. I met Bill Warner on a sticky August evening at the county fair. He was gentle, always the first to offer a coat or a hand with the groceries, and when he laughed, people turned to listen. We didn't have much, just a starter house with thin walls and a backyard that turned muddy every spring. But we had enough, and when Megan was born, I promised her the world, even as I learned how to stretch $1 from here to Christmas. After Bill passed, I kept things steady the best I could. I picked up extra hours at the clinic, made sure Megan had piano lessons and a birthday cake every year, even if it was just from a boxed mix and a candle saved from the last one. Megan grew up sharp as a tack, restless as a summer storm. I watched her chase every opportunity I could put in front of her, first at the local community college, then all the way up to a business program in Chicago I could barely afford. I packed her suitcase and pressed her dresses, told her not to worry about money, even when my hands shook writing the checks. She met Ryan there, all fast talk and polished shoes, always ready with a compliment that never quite stuck to the wall. They got married in a white chapel outside Springfield, a little fancier than we'd planned, and I paid for every rose on those pews with savings I'd meant to use for a trip I never took. After the wedding, it felt like Megan and Ryan drifted further into a world I barely recognized. They bought a sleek condo downtown, talked about private schools for Chloe before she could even tie her own shoes, and the calls home got shorter. I kept my door open and her old room just as she'd left it, pink curtains and trophies collecting dust. I thought if I just kept showing up, kept offering what I could, eventually, she'd remember the mother who stayed up all night sewing her prom dress by hand. Instead, I found myself wiring money for emergencies and holiday gifts that went unacknowledged, answering her texts instead of her voice. The first time I realized the distance between us wasn't just miles, but something sharper was the night she asked me not to drop by unannounced. Said Ryan had important meetings in the living room, and it was best if I called first. I stood on the porch that night, holding a warm casserole lasagna for her birthday, and when she opened the door, her eyes slipped past me like I was the mailman, not her mother. I drove home with the smell of baked cheese still clinging to my coat, and understood, maybe for the first time, that what I thought was love might only be habit, and what I thought was family could vanish without warning. That's how it started. But by the night of that dinner, the night of the wine, I could feel the ground shift under my feet, the air so thick with secrets you could almost taste it. I stood in the dining room, the scent of rosemary still hanging in the air, the candles flickering low on the table. Megan's laughter was sharp, too bright for the soft glow of evening, and Ryan's voice carried across the plates like a commercial selling comfort that never arrived. Chloe sat between them, swinging her feet under the table, a little too quiet for a child her age. My hands shook only slightly as I reached for the silver my mother's pattern polished smooth from decades of Sunday dinners. It was all as it should have been, at least on the surface. But beneath it all, something sour threaded through the night, a kind of silence that rang louder than words. Ryan poured the wine, filling my glass last. His hand lingered on the bottle just a second too long, as if he wanted me to see it. Megan was already turning away, fussing with the salad, her red dress too tight for comfort, her eyes darting toward the foyer every few minutes. When I lifted the glass, a metallic scent rose behind the fruit and oak. I hesitated, but they were watching, so I smiled and took a sip. Bitterness bloomed at the back of my tongue, stronger than anything I'd tasted since my last hospital scan. I set the glass down, coughing politely into my napkin. Megan barely looked up. Ryan reached for the bread, talking about interest rates and real estate, his fork tapping against his plate in a steady, nervous rhythm. 5 minutes later, I quietly swapped my glass with his, nudging it across the table when nobody was looking. He drank without thinking, still carrying on about market trends. Megan's laughter grew forced sharp as broken glass. It didn't take long before Ryan started blinking too much, his voice growing thick. He dropped his fork, then did it again. Megan's hand clamped around his wrist under the table. I excused myself, said I had to check on dessert, and slipped into the kitchen, listening to their voices drift in from the dining room. Through the narrow doorway, I watched as Ryan's face paled. He tugged at his collar, sweat gathering at his temples, the color draining from his cheeks. He mumbled something about the room being too hot, and then stood up so suddenly he sent the gravy boat tumbling onto the lace tablecloth. The chaos was almost quiet, everyone moving at once except me. I stood in the kitchen, hands steady on the towel, watching the scene like it was a memory I'd already lived. Megan shrieked his name. Her mother-in-law jumped up to help, napkin in hand, while Chloe froze wide-eyed and silent. Ryan slumped back into his chair, muttering about dizziness, and Megan pressed her lips together, color gone from her face. I moved slowly, dabbing gravy from my blouse, and met Megan's eyes. "You all right, sweetheart?" My voice sounded calm, practiced from years of holding everyone else steady. She nodded too quickly. "Yes, just Ryan's always running low on blood sugar." Her words fell flat. I patted her shoulder, then leaned in a little closer. "You know, Megan, I think he had my glass." That got her attention. For a moment, I saw the mask slip her eyes, wide lips parted. She didn't answer. Back in the kitchen, I slid the lemon tart from the fridge and set it on the counter, hands working on autopilot. The house was filled with the sound of distant voices, laughter from the living room, the low murmur of Megan explaining Chloe asking if Daddy was sick. I watched the sugar on the tart catch the light, then wrapped it back up and tucked it away. I wasn't sure yet what they'd put in my glass, or what they meant to do. But standing there, I felt the cold certainty of something broken. Not just a plate or a dinner plan, but something at the center of us, the kind of crack that runs straight through the grain and can't be glued back together. After the guests left, Megan returned, moving quickly through the hallway, her shoes loud against the tile. She didn't meet my eyes as she grabbed her purse, cheeks flushed. Her hands fumbled with the clasp, and I heard a small bottle rattle inside. I caught a glimpse of the label, just a few letters, and a warning about drowsiness. Megan paused, then disappeared out the door, her goodbye trailing off behind her. I watched her from the kitchen window, the porch light making her look younger than she was, shoulders hunched, as if she were bracing against more than the weather. The house was quiet now, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the creak of floorboards settling as I wiped the counters and washed each dish. My mind replayed the evening in slow motion, every glance, every nervous laugh, the way Ryan's hand trembled when he reached for his glass. I found myself standing in front of the open dishwasher, staring at the half-full glass he'd left behind. I poured it out, watched the dark wine swirl down the drain, and ran the water until the sink was clear. That night, as I locked the doors and drew the curtains, I couldn't help but remember all the times I'd opened my home to Megan. The sleepovers with her friends, the last-minute piano recitals, the birthday cakes she'd asked for with pink frosting and extra sprinkles. Those memories felt thin, now worn down by time and disappointment. I set the kitchen in order, placed the leftover tart in the fridge, and sat at the table in the silence. The only company, the dull ache in my chest and the ticking of the old clock above the stove. In the days that followed, Megan's voice on the phone was hurried, distracted, never lingering on the details. Just checking in, Mom. Everything okay? Always with Ryan on the other line, or Chloe waiting in the background. I sent money when she asked, sometimes for school fees, sometimes for car repairs, or an unexpected bill. The requests came more often, explanations shorter each time. I gave without question, thinking it might keep me close to them. But every transfer, every small sacrifice seemed to push them further away. The house grew quieter, the phone rang less. When I dropped off a scarf and a card for Chloe's birthday, Megan barely acknowledged it. I waited for a thank you that never came. I thought of all the birthdays I'd marked with handmade cakes, of the stories I'd read at bedtime, of the nights I'd sat in the dark after Bill passed, promising myself I would hold our family together. Now, I waited by the phone, hoping for even a short call, and found myself baking banana bread just to fill the kitchen with something warm. Sometimes I'd see Megan's posts, online photos from weekends away. New clothes for Chloe, a vacation with Ryan's family. There would be captions about blessings and gratitude, but my name was never mentioned. I watched their lives from a distance, always on the outside. The old routines faded, dusting the guest room setting, 2 places at the table, listening for keys in the door that never turned. The loneliness was a quiet ache, something I carried from one day to the next, heavier than I ever let on. Once Megan called, late, voice cracking. Just a small emergency, Mom. Could you wire something Ryan's between jobs and Chloe needs a new coat? I agreed, just as I always did, and told her not to worry, that she'd pay me back when she could. I never asked for repayment. I never pressed. But when the check cleared, I saw pictures of them at a new restaurant celebrating. I didn't comment, didn't let it show. I just noted the date, tucked it away with all the other small betrayals, and folded another load of laundry. I started noticing the other ways I was being edged out. Megan would call to say not to stop by without a heads up, that Ryan was working from home, that Chloe had a full schedule. She told me maybe it was time to think about a place with more support, a community with nurses and activities just in case. I heard the message behind her words. The rooms in my house grew colder, the mail more impersonal, the days marked by routine and silence. Even Chloe's voice when she called sounded distant, as if she was reading from a script. Hi, Grandma. Mommy says thank you for the present. No stories, no laughter, no warmth. I started knitting again, neat little rows that filled the evenings, my hands busy while my mind wandered. I wondered if all the giving, all the holding on, had only taught Megan to keep asking, never to give in return. One afternoon, Megan dropped by, unannounced for once, and her tone was businesslike, her eyes scanning the room, not meeting mine. She handed me a list of expenses, said she'd been meaning to talk about budgeting, that Ryan thought it might be easier if she handled my accounts, just to take some of the stress off me. Her words were smooth, practiced, but her hands fidgeted. I said I'd think about it, and watched her drive away, her car disappearing down the street while I stood in the doorway, sweater pulled tight around my shoulders. The more I tried to hold on, the more I slipped through the cracks. Meals went uneaten. The radio played to an empty kitchen. I found myself standing at the window each morning, coffee cooling in my hands, watching the neighbors' lives move on around me. I waited for the ring of the phone, for a card, for a knock at the door. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in a house that used to be filled with voices. In that quiet, I began to understand. The hurt was no longer a sharp pain, but something dull constant, an ache that had settled in my bones. I could see now that the lines had been drawn, the boundaries pushed, the trust frayed thin. The night of that dinner, when Ryan slumped at the table and Megan looked everywhere but at me, something had shifted. I had become invisible to them, a shadow in my own home, a fixture to be managed or moved. I didn't cry, not then. Instead, I sat at the table, folded my hands, and let the silence fill the room. The taste of that wine lingered sharp and bitter, and I knew it wasn't just the drink. Something deeper had soured between us, something that couldn't be sweetened by another check or a holiday gift. As the sun set and the house grew dark, I felt a stillness settle heavy and unyielding, the kind that comes when you finally understand you are on your own. Morning came slow and gray. The light slid across the kitchen counter, catching on the stack of plates from the night before. I stood there in my robe, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone lukewarm, listening to the hush that settles in a house after everyone's gone. Outside, the yard looked the same, frost on the grass, a squirrel digging by the old oak, but nothing felt familiar. I caught my reflection in the glass hair, unbrushed eyes lined with worry. The corners of my mouth trembled in a way I didn't want anyone to see. I moved through the rooms, resetting the cushions, folding napkins, clearing the scent of dinner from the air. The photo on the hallway table, me, Megan, and Chloe at the botanical gardens, stared up at me, all three smiling, sunlight on our faces. I slipped the picture from its frame and tucked it into my pocket, not wanting to leave it behind. The lemon tart sat untouched on the counter, still bright and perfect, wrapped carefully for a family that never stopped by. I left a note, just a simple enjoy, and stepped out into the cold, locking the door behind me. The drive home was quiet. No radio, just the whir of the heater and the click of my turn signal. My own house waited at the end of the block porch light on wind chimes, knocking softly in the breeze. It should have felt safe, but all I felt was tired. I set my bag down, poured another cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. There was a tightness in my chest that didn't lift, not even when the heater kicked on and warmed my feet. I started making lists, not for groceries or holidays, but for everything I needed to sort out. I gathered old receipts, printouts from the banknotes scribbled on the backs of envelopes. Every transfer to Megan, every little loan, every birthday check, and just this once deposit. It added up faster than I'd ever realized. I canceled the automatic payments, closed out the shared accounts, and sat in the glow of the computer screen while the sun slipped away outside the window. The house was so quiet that even the sound of my typing felt too loud. Dolores stopped by that afternoon, holding a thermos of cinnamon coffee and wearing her pink windbreaker. She settled in at my table like she'd done 100 times before, pouring us each a cup and setting out scones from the bakery. "You sounded tired on the phone last night," she said, her eyes sharp but gentle. I nodded, too drained to make small talk. She slid a business card across the table. "My cousin's boy is a lawyer. Elder law, the good kind. I called him already. He said he'd help if you wanted." I didn't answer at first. Instead, I let her words settle, breathing in the warmth from the mug. I told her what happened at the dinner, the wine, the glass, the way Megan looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching. Dolores listened without blinking. She reached over, squeezed my hand, and said, "You're not crazy, and you're not wrong." I stared at the creases on her knuckles, feeling something in me unravel just a little. It was the first time in weeks I felt less alone. That night, I pulled every folder from the desk drawer and stacked them in the living room. I sat cross-legged on the rug, sorting through the evidence of a life spent, giving each page a little reminder of how easily kindness can be taken for granted. There were cards from Chloe, bank receipts, printouts of Megan's requests, every one a thread in the pattern I'd missed. I read back through the texts and messages, piecing together the story I hadn't wanted to see. A woman doesn't set out to be used, but sometimes she doesn't notice until it's too late. The days blurred together. Megan called only when she needed something, her voice clipped and rushed, never asking about me, always about a bill, or a fee, or a new emergency. Ryan stopped calling altogether. Chloe's thank yous grew shorter, the calls less frequent. Her voice muffled and distant, as if someone was prompting her from the background. I sent packages and cards that were never acknowledged, birthdays and holidays that passed with nothing more than a brief text or a forgotten emoji. I started to wonder if I'd ever been seen at all, or just needed. I tried to keep busy. Knitting in the evenings, baking bread for neighbors, cleaning out drawers and closets, organizing the pantry shelf by shelf. The work helped pass the time, but it didn't fill the empty corners. I talked to Bill's picture on the mantel, sometimes out loud, sometimes just in my head, telling him what I wished I could say to Megan. There was comfort in the routine, but no relief from the ache that had settled deep in my bones. Once I let myself remember the early years. Megan as a child running barefoot in the yard, her laugh bouncing through the open windows. The way she used to reach for my hand in a crowded room. Her voice clear and certain, calling me Mama when she needed comfort. I held those memories like stones in my pocket, rubbing them smooth with use. They were all I had some nights when the house was too quiet and the world felt too big. As the weeks went on, I saw Megan less and less. When she did come by, it was with Ryan, and always with a reason, a form for me to sign, a bill to pay, a favor to ask. She never stayed for coffee. She never sat at the table. Her eyes drifted to her phone, her purse, the clock on the wall. Chloe hid behind her mother, quiet and unsure, her little hands twisting in the hem of her dress. I watched them from across the room, feeling the distance widen with every visit. There were nights when I lay awake listening to the tick of the old clock and the soft hum of the heater. I turned their words over in my mind, every suggestion that maybe it was time to look into a place with more care, every joke about aging and just in case. I knew what they meant. I wasn't wanted, not really. Not unless I was sending money or solving their problems. The realization came slow, like water wearing down stone. By the time it settled, I understood what had been lost. One afternoon, I got a call from the bank, a notice about a joint account Ryan had set up, withdrawals I hadn't authorized, payments I didn't recognize. I changed the passwords, closed the account, and felt something shift inside me. That night, I opened a new folder, started writing down everything, every time I'd felt invisible, every moment I'd been overlooked, every dollar that had slipped away without thanks. It was a record, a kind of ledger, not out of anger, but because I needed to see it all in one place. The house was mine again, but it felt emptier than ever. I cooked smaller meals, ate in silence, stacked my knitting in neat rows by the armchair. The phone rang less and less. Dolores stopped by every few days, bringing coffee and stories from the neighborhood. We sat on the porch, watching the seasons change, talking about anything but family. In those hours, I could almost forget the hurt, almost believe that the ache in my chest was just the weather turning cold. But even in the quiet, the memories pressed in. The sound of Megan's voice as a little girl, the way Bill would come in from work and sweep her up in his arms. Chloe's laughter at Christmas, the way she'd cling to my skirt while I baked. Those moments lingered sharp and sweet. I kept them close, even as I let go of everything else. The silence grew familiar, a kind of companion. I learned to fill it with small rituals, watering the plants, feeding the birds, writing notes I'd never send. The ache dulled, became a part of me. I understood now that sometimes loving someone means knowing when to step back. The house was still, the air heavy with all the things unsaid. But I began to find comfort in my own company, in the steady rhythm of days that belonged to me alone. I didn't know what would come next, but as the sun set, behind the old oak tree painting gold on the kitchen wall, I understood that surviving wasn't the same as living. I folded away the last of the laundry, poured a cup of tea, and sat by the window, waiting for a new kind of morning. And somewhere in that quiet, I realized something had to change. It was the second Thursday of the month when I woke before sunrise, the old house cold and still. I moved quietly through the kitchen, filling the kettle, and setting a cup on the counter, listening to the pipes groan as the water heated. The morning was sharp with winter air leaking in through the window over the sink. I pressed my hand to the glass, feeling the chill bite my palm, and looked out at the bird bath frozen solid beneath the big oak tree. For a while, I just stood there, the hum of the heater and the ticking clock the only sounds. It was the first time in years that I let myself stand still and truly take in the silence. By 8, the sun had crept halfway across the backyard. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee cooling beside a notepad, the pen heavy in my hand. I drew a line down the middle and started writing not a grocery list or birthdays to remember, but what needed to change. Cancel the transfers. Gather the bank statements. Call the lawyer Dolores recommended. Rework the will. The list kept growing as the light shifted across the linoleum. I paused every so often to look up, listening for a sound that never came. A phone ringing, a child's voice, someone knocking at the door. I wrote everything out in a slow, careful hand, not rushing, letting each word settle. When I finished, I set the pen aside and looked around the kitchen, my world suddenly smaller, but for the first time in a long time, more solid beneath my feet. Mid-morning, Dolores arrived in her winter coat, cheeks pink from the cold, a box of bakery scones under one arm. She stepped inside without asking, setting the box on the table and pouring coffee from her thermos. "How are you holding up?" she asked, watching me over the rim of her mug. I told her about the list, the transfers, the dinner that still lingered in my mind. Dolores didn't flinch. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small card with her cousin's boy's name on it, elder law, specializing in people who'd had just about enough. "He's expecting your call," she said, pushing the card across the table. "Told him you were sharp as a tack and tired of being taken for granted." We sat for a while, not saying much, letting the heat from our cups and the sound of the old refrigerator fill the kitchen. I asked her if she ever wondered where it all went wrong. Dolores shrugged, took another bite of her scone, and said, "Sometimes you just wake up and know it's time." Her words hung in the air, heavy as the frost on the grass. When she left, she gave my hand a squeeze and told me to start calling in favors just like I'd done for everyone else all those years. After she'd gone, I moved through the house, gathering every folder and scrap of paper with Megan's handwriting, every card from Chloe, every receipt for the wire transfers and bills I'd paid. I made piles on the dining room table, the same one where we'd celebrated holidays, the same one where I'd watched Ryan wobble and slur after sipping from my glass. I laid everything out in neat rows, organizing what I'd given, what had been asked, what was never returned. The sun dipped behind the clouds as I worked the day, passing in quiet, steady movements. By dusk, the house was covered in notes and statements. I sat down with my back to the window, looking at the pattern that emerged, a map of years spent giving, until there was hardly anything left for myself. I called the lawyer, explained what had happened, and listened as he told me what to do. His voice was calm, practical, never once making me feel foolish for loving too hard. He told me I was right to keep records right, to ask questions, right to want better. That evening, I made soup and ate by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on. The phone rang, once a number I recognized as Megan's, but I let it go to voicemail. I didn't want to hear another rushed apology or another request for money. Instead, I wrote another list this time of the things I wanted to keep just for myself. My mother's pie server, the quilt. Bill's mother made the picture of Chloe with her missing front teeth smiling at the camera. I gathered each one and placed it where I'd see it every day. Before bed, I stood in the living room and looked at Bill's photo on the mantel, the two of us younger, smiling, his arm around my shoulder. "It's time," I said, voice soft in the empty room. "I can't carry it all anymore." The words didn't echo. They just settled, gentle and final. I slept deeper that night than I had in months. No dreams, no restless tossing. In the morning, I opened the curtains wide and let the pale winter light fill the room. There was still pain, still a heaviness in my chest, but I felt the edges of it start to loosen. I made coffee, sat with my notebook, and began a new page, one that didn't have Megan's name at the top, one that started with a single word: enough. That was the day the waiting ended. I called the lawyer, set the appointments, and told the bank to freeze the old accounts. I packed up a box for the thrift store, tidied the guest room, and pulled the last of Megan's old coats from the closet. Every small act felt like drawing a line steady and sure, reclaiming the space I'd given away piece by piece. I listened to the quiet, not as a punishment, but as proof that this life, this house, was still mine. The wind rattled the window pane as I finished my coffee, and I found myself smiling just a little at the thought of what might come next. Even as I set down the cup, I knew there was more to do. The hardest part wasn't letting go of Megan or Ryan, or even the hope that things might go back to how they were. The hardest part was learning to trust myself again, to stand alone in my own home and know that I was enough. The day slipped by quiet and ordinary, but something inside me had shifted for good. That evening, I made a promise to myself: no more waiting for calls that never came, no more holding my breath for apologies that would never arrive. I locked the front door, turned off the lights, and settled in for the night, ready at last to protect what was left of my heart. And as the house fell still around me, I felt the first stirrings of resolve, gentle but certain, carrying me toward whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning after, I called the lawyer. I made a point to rise before the sun. The house was quiet, every shadow in its usual place. But something felt different as I moved from room to room, gathering the paperwork that spelled out years of trust. I stacked every bank statement and wire transfer on the kitchen table, pairing each with the notes I'd kept, each small memory of giving, each promise that things would get better. I poured myself a cup of coffee and let the steam warm my hands as I waited for the clock to reach 9. Dolores came by at 8, just as the first light stretched across the backyard. She handed me a flash drive, her face pinched with determination. "Everything you sent me, every receipt and message, it's all here," she said. I thanked her, holding it in my palm like a stone, then slipped it into the folder marked "For Attorney." We sat side by side, sipping coffee, neither of us speaking. There was comfort in the silence, the old kind that comes from sharing years of stories and the quiet of early mornings. Before she left, Dolores paused by the front door, looking back over her shoulder. "Don't let them talk you out of this," she said. "You've given enough." At 10 o'clock sharp, I dialed Mr. Pike's number, the lawyer Dolores had recommended. His voice was steady, measured, patient, as he asked me to walk him through what had happened. I laid out the story piece by piece, never rushing, how Megan and Ryan's requests had grown, how the dinner with the wine had changed everything, how I'd begun to realize the line between family and obligation had been crossed. He listened, never interrupting, taking down each detail. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and said, "You've done the right thing coming to me. We can fix this. You're not alone." By noon, I had a checklist: close every joint account, change all passwords, document every transfer. Mr. Pike assured me he would take care of the will, setting up a trust for Chloe with clear boundaries Megan and Ryan couldn't cross. The relief was quiet but deep, a loosening inside me as I realized for the first time in years I was allowed to set limits. I opened a new account in my name, only transferred my savings, and sat at the dining room table filling out forms with a calm hand. I called the bank and asked them to freeze the old accounts. The woman on the other end spoke softly, as if she'd heard stories like mine before. "You'd be surprised how many folks call with the same thing," she said. "You're not the first and you won't be the last." I changed the locks that afternoon. The hardware store clerk cut 2 new keys, no questions asked, and I spent an hour at home testing each one, feeling the solid click of the deadbolt each time the door closed. I gathered the last of Megan's old coats from the closet, boxed them up, and stacked them by the door to take to the thrift store. With every task, a little more of the heaviness in my chest began to lift. Later that day, I got an alert from the bank, an automatic withdrawal attempt from Megan's account, something labeled emergency mortgage payment. It bounced. The bank called her this time, not me. I set my phone aside and let the silence in the house grow thick. I didn't answer when Megan called or when Ryan's number flashed on the screen. The messages came in. "Mom, we need to talk, and can you call me? There's a problem with the account." I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching as a pair of finches chased each other across the fence line. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. By the end of the week, the phone was ringing more than ever. Megan's voice was different in her messages now, no longer rushed, but tight, pleading. "Mom, something's happened with the accounts. We're in trouble. Please call me." Ryan called next, leaving a message about acting like adults and working things out. I blocked his number, then forwarded the voicemail to Mr. Pike, who replied with a simple, "Good move." I spent the rest of the day cleaning the house from top to bottom, scrubbing the grout, washing the curtains in lemon soap, and laying Bill's old cufflinks in their box. The work grounded me. With each small act, I claimed the space again. I opened the windows and let in the late winter air, dusted the picture frames, and rearranged the keepsakes on the mantel. It was my home, and I meant to keep it that way. That night, as I settled in with my knitting, the phone rang once more, a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Later, when I listened, I heard Megan's voice trembling. "Mom, I know you're upset. I know I made mistakes. Please, we need your help." She cried softly at the end, but her words were careful, never quite naming what had happened, never apologizing, just asking for another chance. I saved the voicemail not for proof, but as a reminder. Even now, with everything changing, some things would never be said aloud. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch, the air cold but clear. The sky stretched wide above the rooftops, the kind of blue that feels honest without pretense. I stood there for a long while, the new keys in my hand, and watched the neighborhood come to life. Children heading to school, the mail carrier making her rounds, Dolores walking her dog. For the first time in a long while, I felt a quiet sense of control. I wasn't waiting for anyone to show up, wasn't hoping for a call or an apology. Back inside, I packed up Megan's framed photos, leaving only the one of Chloe on the side table, a gap-toothed smile, sunlight in her hair, holding a fistful of dandelions. I tucked Bill's wedding band into the jewelry box, the old silver pie server into its drawer, and made a list of groceries that didn't include anyone else's favorites, but my own. Evening came softly. I made myself soup and sat at the table, letting the steam warm my face as the sky turned from gold to navy outside the window. I turned off the porch light, checked the locks, and pulled the curtains closed. For the first time in years, I let myself rest without keeping an ear out for the phone. There would be more calls, more messages, and maybe a visit or two. But for now, the only thing that mattered was the quiet inside my own home. Tomorrow would come with new questions and decisions. I finished my tea, washed the cup, and placed it in the drying rack. I watched the clock tick toward 9 and felt something inside me steady. I had taken a step small but certain, and the house held its breath with me waiting to see what would come next. A cold wind rattled the windows the morning the first letter arrived. It was from the bank, a formal notice about the joint account I'd just closed, letting me know the autopay for Megan and Ryan's mortgage had bounced. I set the letter on the table beside my coffee and waited for the phone to ring. Sure enough, before noon, Megan called 3 times in a row, each message more urgent than the last. I let everyone go to voicemail. The words blended together. Mom, the payment didn't go through. Ryan's work is a mess. Can we talk? But I kept my hands busy folding laundry and rinsing dishes, letting the silence answer for me. The next call was from Ryan. His voice, usually smooth, was tight with frustration. This isn't funny, Linda. We're adults here. Just pick up and let's work it out. I blocked his number and sent the message to Mr. Pike, who replied with a steady, "You're doing fine. Stay the course." That night, I tidied the kitchen and poured a cup of tea sitting by the window as the sun slipped behind the trees. The sky turned pale blue to silver, and the street grew quiet. I watched the lamplight flicker across the driveway, not waiting for anyone, just letting the calm settle around me. Megan's next message came late, a voicemail with a thin, desperate edge to it. Mom, please. I know I made mistakes. I know you're angry. Just call me. Chloe's scared. We're drowning here. She didn't say what she'd done, didn't name the truth. It was the same as always, sorry for the consequences, never for the act itself. I played the message twice, then deleted it. There was nothing left to answer. I filled the sink with hot water, washed the cups and plates, and felt a strange peace in the slow rhythm of everyday chores. The days turned colder. I went about my routines, changing the sheets, sweeping the porch, baking a loaf of bread for Dolores. She stopped by one morning with a box of pastries, her coat zipped up to her chin and her cheeks pink from the cold. She glanced at the pile of letters on my table. More bank notices, an overdraft warning for Megan, a final notice from the utility company. You holding up? She asked. I nodded, poured her coffee, and sat with her while the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and steam. We talked about the birds in the yard, the cold snap coming next week, the best way to keep the pipes from freezing. She didn't press, didn't ask about Megan, just listened to the quiet, the way only old friends can. One afternoon, the doorbell rang while I was dusting the shelves. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and peeked through the curtain. Megan stood on the front step alone. Her coat buttoned wrong, hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She shifted from foot to foot, eyes red and tired. I didn't rush to open the door. Instead, I stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The air between us felt thin and uncertain. She looked up, trying to muster a smile. Mom, thank God. We're not okay. Chloe's been asking for you. Ryan's a mess, the house. She stopped herself, swallowing hard. We need help. I stood quietly, arms folded, waiting. Her eyes searched mine. Please, I know you're angry. I just wanted things to go smoothly that night. I didn't want you to embarrass us. Her words trailed off, voice cracking as she looked away. I let the silence stretch, letting her feel the weight of it. When I finally spoke, my words came out steady and calm. You drugged my wine, Megan. She flinched, her face draining of color. I just wanted peace, she whispered. You took my voice, I said, keeping my gaze level. She reached out, but I took a step back. I've changed my will. You and Ryan are no longer included. Chloe will be taken care of, but only when she's grown, only if she meets the criteria I set. Her hands shook. You're really shutting us out? She asked. I shook my head slowly. I'm setting boundaries, I said. You don't come into my home, you don't ask for money, you don't speak for Chloe. She let out a sound that was almost a sob, and for a moment, I saw the little girl she used to be, afraid of losing something she'd never valued until now. But I didn't open the door. I just waited while she gathered herself, wiped her eyes, and turned to leave. The house was quiet again, but the peace was heavier than before. I poured myself another cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, letting the steam warm my hands. For the first time, I felt the line between us was clear, drawn not in anger, but in self-preservation. The sun slipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I watched the light fade, feeling the shape of my life change in ways I hadn't expected. That evening, I pulled out Bill's old ledger, the one I'd used for years to track bills and birthdays, and wrote down the date, the day I protected what was left. I closed the book and tucked it back on the shelf, feeling steady even as the ache of old love lingered. The phone rang once more that night, the familiar tune Megan had set for herself years ago. I let it play out, not reaching for the receiver, just listening to the sound fade into silence. There was nothing left to say. 3 days passed without a word from Megan or Ryan. The house settled into a hush that felt deeper than before. Not empty, but cleared out, as if it had finally claimed back its corners. I filled the quiet with small routines, baking a peach cobbler, sweeping the back porch, clipping the last of the autumn roses for a vase by the window. The phone sat untouched, each missed call, a reminder of the boundaries I'd set. I spent the mornings with a crossword and the evenings watching the blue shadows stretch across the yard. The world beyond my door moved on, children rode their bikes, neighbors raked leaves, Dolores waved from across the fence. For the first time in years, I let myself be still. It was Thursday afternoon when the phone rang again, the ringtone Megan had chosen so long ago, a soft melody she'd picked out as a teenager back when she'd call, just to say she loved me. I let it ring twice before picking up, holding the receiver steady, as her voice reached through the line quieter than I'd ever heard. Mom, I know you don't want to talk to me, but Chloe's been asking why you won't answer her calls. Her words faltered. She drew you a picture. It's on her wall. She misses you. The ache in my chest tightened. Not sharp, just steady and low. I listened to her try to bridge the silence, her voice small as she added, She thinks you're mad at her. For a while, I didn't speak, just listened to the hush on the other end. I'm not mad at Chloe. I said the words coming out gentle, clear. Megan was silent, and then, She wants to come see you, just for a little while. I thought of Chloe's smile, her wild curls, her drawings taped to the fridge. You can talk to me. Megan, I said, but not inside. There was a pause. The porch, I nodded as if she could see me. They arrived that afternoon, Chloe bounding up the walkway, clutching a folded sheet of paper, her cheeks pink from the cold. Megan lingered behind, shoulders hunched, eyes red. Chloe threw her arms around me before I could say a word, her voice muffled in my sweater. Grandma, I made you a picture. Don't forget to put it on your fridge. I smoothed her hair, feeling the weight of her trust. I promise, baby. Right in the center. We sat on the porch swing, Chloe between us, kicking her feet and talking about school and her new ballet slippers. Megan sat quietly, glancing down at her hands. When Chloe ran off to chase a squirrel in the yard, Megan finally spoke. I know I don't deserve your kindness. she said softly. I shook my head. You're Chloe's mother. I'll be civil, but don't mistake civility for trust. She didn't argue, just nodded, her breath misting in the chilly air. We sat like that for a long time, listening to the wind in the trees, the creak of the porch swing beneath us. My tea went cold in my hands, but I didn't mind. After a while, I asked, "You ever wonder why I never remarried?" Megan looked up, surprised. After Dad died, I had chances. Good men, steady jobs. But I promised myself I'd give you a life with choices. She pressed her lips together, and for a moment, I saw her old self open, uncertain, wanting so much to belong somewhere. I made a mistake, I said. I confused sacrifice with silence. I won't do that again. Chloe raced back up the steps, pushing the drawing into my hands. A house, a big tree, a figure in a rocking chair. That's you, Grandma, with the birds in your yard. I hugged her close, breathing in the smell of soap and winter and crayons. Megan gathered her things, eyes shining, but steady now. Will we see you again? She asked. I tilted my head, meeting her gaze. Maybe, when you stop asking what I can give and start asking what you've done. She nodded, silent understanding blooming across her face. As they left, I carried Chloe's picture inside and pinned it to the fridge with my sunflower magnet right above the grocery list, just where she'd see it next time. The house filled with the hush of evening, the faint hum of the heater, the memory of Chloe's arms around my neck. I stood at the window, watching the sun drift behind the trees, feeling the distance grow and soften all at once. I pressed a hand to the glass and whispered thanks for the quiet, the boundaries, the freedom to decide what comes next. And as darkness fell, I realized that the peace I'd earned was deeper than silence. It was the knowledge that I could protect my own heart, and that at last was enough. That night, after Megan and Chloe left the house, felt both larger and quieter than ever before. I tidied up the kitchen, pausing by the fridge to straighten Chloe's picture. Her careful crayon lines, the bright yellow sun. She always added the big tree out front with birds that seemed to wave from every branch. I stood there for a long moment, tracing the edge of the drawing. Thinking of all the years I'd spent trying to fill every silence, trying to hold a family together even as the seams wore thin. Now, with the porch empty and the phone finally still, I understood something I'd never let myself admit. Sometimes, love is about letting go and trusting that the best of you remains in the ones you raised, even if they wander far from your arms. In the days that followed, I kept my routines: coffee at sunrise, the crossword puzzle, baking for Dolores and the neighbors. Life returned to its natural pace, gentle and steady, no longer tangled up in someone else's chaos. There were quiet afternoons when I'd glance at the window, half expecting a car to pull in, but I let those moments pass without regret. Instead, I found comfort in small things: the smell of cinnamon rolls baking, the feel of warm dishwater, the simple peace of locking my own door at night. My home was truly mine again, each room a testament to what I had built and what I had reclaimed. Megan called once more, her voice softer this time, asking if I was well. I told her the truth. I was. She didn't ask for anything, and I didn't offer. There was an understanding between us, a new kind of boundary, firm but not unkind. She had her life to repair, her own lessons to learn, and I knew it wasn't my job to fix what wasn't broken by my hands. I missed Chloe, of course, but I knew she'd grow up seeing a grandmother who finally learned to protect her heart and her dignity. And maybe in time, that would teach her the difference between love and obligation. The seasons shifted, and spring crept back into the yard. I planted new flowers beneath the old oak tree, watching as fresh shoots pushed up through the dark soil. Dolores came by with her cinnamon coffee, and we sat on the porch talking about everything and nothing. Two women who'd seen more than our share of life's sharp turns, each of us still standing. There was a quiet pride in knowing I had survived the kind of heartbreak that leaves no bruises but takes years to heal. One afternoon, I caught myself humming as I swept the front steps, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. It struck me that justice doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it settles in with the slow return of self-respect and the quiet freedom to say no. Dignity, I realized, is something you can lose a little at a time and win back the same way, one boundary, one brave conversation, one silent evening at a time. If you've listened all the way through, I hope you'll take a moment tonight to remember your own worth, to draw your own lines, and to know it's never too late to protect what matters. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If this story spoke to you, or if you've ever had to find your way back to yourself, I hope you'll stay a little longer, share your story, or just remember that you're not alone.